Nami lawyer looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Eleanor, if you sign those papers, I will have failed you completely." I picked up the pen anyway, and I smiled. Everyone in that conference room thought I had lost my mind. My daughter was crying quietly in the corner. My lawyer had his head in his hands, and my husband of 43 years sat across the table with that smug little grin I had learned to hate, the one he saved for moments when he thought he had won. He thought he had won. He had no idea that I had already been planning this for 8 months. Let me start from the beginning, because none of this will make sense unless you understand who I was before that day, and who I became after. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was a high school English teacher in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. I loved my job. I loved my students. I loved the smell of old books and the way a teenager's face changed when a story finally clicked for them. I taught for 31 years, and I was good at it. But the life I built outside of those classroom walls, that was where I poured everything else I had. I met my husband, Gerald, when I was 24 years old. He was 27, charming, and had this confident way of walking into a room like he already owned it. At 24, I found that magnetic. At 68, I understand it for what it was. He married me 6 months after we met, and I spent the next 4 decades believing that was the most romantic thing that had ever happened to me. Gerald worked in commercial real estate. Not the glamorous kind, not the Manhattan skyscrapers or the luxury developments. He brokered deals on office parks and strip malls and warehouse spaces in central Ohio. It was steady work, good money, and it required a lot of travel, a lot of dinners, a lot of late nights. I accepted all of that. I raised our 2 children, our daughter Patricia and our son Michael, mostly on my own during those years. I managed the household. I balanced the books. Every time Gerald needed to close a deal and needed his shirts pressed and his calendar organized and his anniversary with a client remembered, I was the one who handled it. I never asked for a thank you. That was just marriage, I thought. That was just partnership. What I did not know, what I would not find out until Gerald was 65 years old and already 3 years into an affair, was that partnership had never meant the same thing to both of us. I found out on a Tuesday in March, not dramatically, not with a phone falling out of his pocket or lipstick on a collar. I found out because Gerald, for the first time in 43 years, got careless. He left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to take a shower, and a message popped up on the screen. I was not snooping. I was setting down a cup of coffee next to the counter, and the notification was simply there, and the name attached to it was not one I recognized, and the words in the preview were not words a woman sends to a man she has a professional relationship with. I did not open the laptop. I stepped back. I stood very still in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, the same window I had looked through for 30 years while I washed dishes and watched my children play in the backyard. Then I walked upstairs, went into the bathroom, turned on the cold water, and pressed both hands flat against the counter until the shaking stopped. Her name, I would later learn, was Danielle. She was 34 years old. Gerald was 65. I did not confront him that day. I did not confront him that week. I know that sounds strange to a lot of people. The first instinct is always to say something, to scream, to demand answers. But I am an English teacher. I have spent my entire career analyzing stories, and I understood immediately that the confrontation was not the important part. The important part was what came before it and what came after. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I said a single word. So I started paying attention in a way I never had before, not to Gerald's whereabouts or his phone. I was not interested in building a case for adultery. I was interested in something else entirely. Because in 31 years of managing our household finances, I had always handled the personal accounts, the mortgage, the utilities, the children's education funds, the grocery budget. Gerald handled the business side, his brokerage accounts, his commission structures, his professional expenses. We had always kept those separate, and I had never questioned it. Gerald said it was cleaner that way. I had believed him. Now I started to wonder what cleaner actually meant. I called my friend Ruth, who had been my closest friend since we were both 26 years old and first-year teachers at the same school. Ruth's ex-husband had put her through a brutal divorce 15 years earlier, and she had come out the other side sharp and steady and with no illusions about how these things worked. I drove to her house on the Saturday morning while Gerald was at what he called a property showing, and I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. Ruth listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Before you say a word to him, you need to see a lawyer, not a family friend. A real divorce attorney." I told her I was not sure I wanted a divorce yet. She looked at me the way only a woman who has been through it can look at you. "Eleanor," she said, "it does not matter what you want yet. You need to know what you have." I made an appointment that Monday with an attorney named Sandra. She had been practicing family law for 22 years, and she had a quiet, focused way of listening that made me trust her immediately. I laid out everything I knew: the length of the marriage, the assets I was aware of, the financial structure Gerald and I had maintained. Sandra asked me a series of questions, and somewhere around the third or fourth question, she paused and looked at me carefully. "You said your husband manages all of his own business finances separately," she said. "He always has," I told her. "And you have never had access to those accounts? Never reviewed his commission statements, his brokerage filings?" "No," he said. "It was simpler that way." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Eleanor, in my experience, when one spouse has maintained complete financial separation for the duration of a long marriage, there is sometimes a reason for that beyond simplicity. I would like to recommend a forensic accountant before we go any further." I did not fully understand what that meant yet, but I said yes. His name was David, and he was a compact, methodical man in his early 50s who wore the same style of gray suit every time I saw him, and who had a way of explaining complex financial information in plain, quiet language that I genuinely appreciated. Over the next 3 months, while Gerald continued going to his property showings and I continued making dinner and asking about his day, David was working quietly through 8 years of business records that Sandra had formally requested through the discovery process. I want to be clear, I had not yet told Gerald I was seeing an attorney. I had not confronted him. I had not changed anything about my behavior at home. This was, I know, an unusual choice. My daughter Patricia would later tell me it was the bravest and the most frightening thing she had ever watched someone do. But I had a reason for it. I needed Gerald to feel completely secure, because a man who feels secure gets careless. And Gerald had already shown me on that Tuesday in March with the laptop open on the counter that careless was something he was capable of. David came back to Sandra's office with his findings on a Thursday afternoon in October. I sat across from both of them at the conference table, and David opened a folder and began to walk me through numbers. I had brought a notepad. I did not end up needing it because what David explained was, in the end, not complicated. The mechanics were elaborate, but the core of it was simple. Over a period of approximately 7 years, Gerald had been systematically routing commission income through a series of shell LLCs that existed primarily on paper. The income flowed in, was reclassified as operational expenses, and effectively disappeared from any financial record that would be visible in a standard marital asset review. David estimated that the concealed amount, conservatively, was somewhere between $340,000 and $410,000. Additionally, there was a property, a small commercial unit in a town about 40 miles from Columbus, that Gerald had purchased 6 years ago and never disclosed. The property had appreciated. It was currently worth approximately $180,000. Sandra let me sit with that information for a moment before she spoke. "What he has done," she said carefully, "has a name. It is called fraudulent concealment of marital assets. In Ohio, it is not only relevant to the divorce settlement, it can also carry separate legal and financial consequences." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. She told me. I went home that evening and made pot roast for dinner because it was Gerald's favorite and I wanted everything to look exactly normal. He ate 2 helpings and told me it was delicious and asked if I had seen his charger. I told him it was on the nightstand. I washed the dishes after he went to watch television, and I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the dark backyard, thinking about 31 years of pot roast and pressed shirts and calendar management. I had made a decision somewhere between David's office and my driveway that evening. Not an angry decision, a clear one. I told Gerald I wanted to talk the following Saturday morning. I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had stood when I saw that message on his laptop, and I told him calmly that I knew about Danielle and that I wanted a divorce. He went through the stages quickly. Denial, then a version of anger that was really just embarrassment, then a pivot to something that looked almost like relief. He had been waiting for this, I realized. He had probably been hoping I would find out so he would not have to be the one to say it first. Then he said the thing I had been expecting him to say. "I think it makes sense for us to keep this simple," he told me. "No lawyers, no court. I will take the business assets since those are mine. You keep the house and your pension, and we both move on." He said it like he was doing me a favor. "Let me think about it," I said. I went back to Sandra's office the following Monday. I told her what Gerald had proposed. She shook her head slowly. "His business assets," she said, "are not solely his. Not after 43 years of marriage in this state, and certainly not given what David found. If he wants to make an informal offer, he can make it through my office. But Eleanor," she looked at me steadily, "you have significant leverage here that he does not know you have. I would strongly advise you not to negotiate until you understand the full weight of what you are holding. This is the part that matters. This is the part that I want every woman who is listening to understand." Gerald believed he was in control of this situation because he believed he was in control of the information. He thought he knew what we had, and he thought I didn't. That asymmetry was his entire strategy. And Sandra was right. I was holding something he did not know existed. The question was how to use it. Sandra wanted to go into mediation with everything on the table immediately, and under normal circumstances, that would have been the right move. But I had been thinking about something for several weeks, something that had started as a vague instinct and had sharpened into a strategy. Gerald was not going to negotiate honestly. I knew him. I knew the way his mind worked. If we walked into mediation with the forensic findings, he would immediately lawyer up with someone aggressive, and we would spend the next 2 years in litigation while his attorneys worked to discredit David's analysis. He had the resources to sustain that fight. I did not. Not emotionally, not financially, and frankly, not in terms of time. I was 68 years old. I did not want to spend 2 years in a courtroom. What I wanted was to end this quickly, and I wanted Gerald to make a mistake. Specifically, I wanted him to commit to his fraudulent position in writing, in a legal document, before he realized what he was committing to. I told Sandra what I was thinking. She was quiet for a very long moment. "If I understood you correctly," she said slowly, "you want to let him believe he is winning the negotiation." "Yes," I said, "you want to sign an agreement that appears to give him everything he asked for." "An agreement that appears to," I said, with specific language that Sandra, you are going to review very carefully. She looked at me for a long time. Then, for the first time since I had walked into her office 7 months earlier, she smiled. It was a small smile, professional, but it was there. "Tell me exactly what you have in mind," she said. The agreement we drafted was, on its surface, exactly what Gerald had proposed. He took the business assets. I kept the house and my pension. Simple. Clean. The kind of thing a man who thinks he has outmaneuvered his wife signs without reading the footnotes. There were footnotes. Not hidden, not fraudulent. Sandra was meticulous about that. Every clause was legal, every term was valid. But buried in the standard language of the asset declaration were 2 things Gerald's cursory review missed entirely. First, a clause requiring full disclosure of all assets held under any business entity in which either party held an ownership interest, with penalties for non-disclosure to be adjudicated post-settlement. Second, a representation that the disclosed business assets constituted the complete holdings of his professional entities, with Gerald's signature as attestation. He was signing a legal declaration that the assets he had listed, the visible ones, the sanitized ones, were everything. while David's report sat in Sandra's filing cabinet documenting $500,000 worth of assets that were not on that list. The day we sat down to sign, Gerald brought his own attorney, a man named Philip, who had clearly been brought in late and had reviewed the documents quickly. Philip read through the agreement in about 12 minutes. He suggested one minor change to the timeline on the house transfer. Gerald accepted it. Then Gerald signed. I signed after him. Sandra witnessed both signatures, and as I set the pen down, Gerald looked across the table at me with that grin, the one I had learned to hate. "This is the right thing, Eleanor," he said. "Fresh start for both of us." I said, "I think you're right, Gerald." 3 weeks later, Sandra filed the motion. I will be honest with you. The 3 weeks between the signing and the motion were the hardest weeks of the entire 8 months. Not because I was afraid the plan wouldn't work. Sandra and David had been thorough, and the legal foundation was solid. The hard part was the people around me. Patricia had been present at the signing, and she had cried the entire drive home, convinced I had made the worst mistake of my life. My son Michael, who lived in Seattle and had been following events from a distance, called me twice that week to tell me he was worried. Even Ruth, who had been with me through all of it, sat across from me in her kitchen and said, "Eleanor, I trust you, but please tell me you know what you're doing." I told her I knew exactly what I was doing. The motion Sandra filed requested an emergency review of the settlement on the grounds of fraudulent concealment of marital assets, supported by David's full forensic accounting report. Attached to the motion was the signed settlement agreement, including Gerald's attestation that his disclosed assets were complete. Attached to David's report was documentation of the Shell LLCs, the reclassified commissions, and the undisclosed commercial property. Gerald's attorney called Sandra's office within 48 hours. I was not present for those calls. Sandra handled them, and she relayed the substance to me each evening. The first call was aggressive. Philip insisted the motion was without merit and threatened countersuits. The second call, 2 days later, was considerably less aggressive. By the third call, Philip was no longer doing most of the talking. Gerald called me directly on a Sunday afternoon, which he should not have done. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that started firm and ended somewhere closer to desperate. He said the accountant had made errors. He said the LLCs were legitimate business structures. He said he wanted to talk, just the two of us, no lawyers. I did not call him back. What I did not know, what even Sandra did not fully anticipate, was that David's report had triggered something larger. One of the Shell LLCs Gerald had used involved a business partner who had his own set of investors, and when those investors were notified of the forensic findings, 2 of them filed their own complaints. Sandra told me this on a Wednesday morning with the carefully neutral tone of someone who is delivering news that is significant, but that she does not want to editorialize. "There may be additional proceedings," she said, "that are entirely separate from the divorce settlement review. Gerald may be facing inquiries that go beyond what we initiated." I sat with that for a moment. "Is there anything I need to do?" I asked. "No," Sandra said. "You may be contacted for information, but you have done nothing wrong. You are, in every legal sense, the wronged party." The settlement review took 4 months. I will not walk you through every procedural step, because honestly, after the first month, my role in it was mostly waiting. Sandra and David handled the legal and financial dimensions. Gerald's team, after the initial posturing, shifted into a mode that Sandra described as damage containment. They were no longer fighting the existence of the concealed assets. They were negotiating how the correction would look. In the end, the revised settlement included the full value of the concealed assets, properly disclosed and divided. The commercial property was appraised and its value was applied to my portion of the settlement. Gerald's attestation in the original agreement, the one he signed without reading carefully, had effectively foreclosed most of his legal options for disputing the forensic findings because he had sworn in writing that those findings could not exist. Sandra called me on a Friday afternoon in late spring to tell me the revised settlement had been finalized. I was in my backyard when she called. I had started a small garden that spring. Nothing elaborate, just tomatoes and herbs along the south fence, something I had always wanted to do, but never had time for during the school year. I was kneeling in the dirt with my gardening gloves on when my phone rang, and I stood up and listened to Sandra tell me that it was over. I thanked her. I stood there for a while after the call ended, looking at the tomato plants, which were about 6 inches tall and doing well. Patricia drove down from Cleveland that weekend. She arrived on Saturday morning with coffee and pastries from the bakery I like, and we sat at the kitchen table. The same table, always the same table, and I told her everything, all of it. The 8 months of it, from the laptop notification to David's report to the footnotes in the settlement agreement. I watched her face go through about 12 different expressions in the span of 20 minutes. At the end, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, you planned all of this." "Yes," I said, "for 8 months. Yes, while making pot roast and asking about his charger." I smiled at her. Someone had to. She laughed, and then she cried a little, and then she reached across the table, and then she reached across the table and took my hand. "I am so sorry I didn't trust you," she said. I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. She had seen what she was supposed to see. That was the point. Michael flew in the following month. He is quieter than Patricia, more internal, and he spent most of the first evening just sitting with me on the back porch without saying much. At some point he said, "Did you ever think about just confronting him?" "Right away?" "Every day for the first 2 weeks," I told him honestly. "What stopped you?" I thought about it for a moment. "I teach literature," I said. "I have spent 30 years telling teenagers that the most important thing about a story is not what happens, it is what the character learns, and when. The timing matters. If I had confronted your father the day I found out, I would have had my feelings and nothing else. I needed more than my feelings." Michael nodded slowly. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he called me, After the motion was filed, he wanted me to talk to you. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry he put you in that position." "Don't be." I told him I was staying out of it. He paused. I also told him he should have read the footnotes. I laughed harder than I had in a long time. "I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters more than any of the legal strategy or the financial maneuvering or the satisfaction of watching a careful plan unfold correctly." There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of this. I think it was January, the cold snap when the pipes nearly froze, when I was sitting alone in this house at about 11 o'clock at night, and I felt the weight of 43 years settling over me all at once. Not anger, not grief exactly, just the immense, exhausting awareness of what had been real and what had been performance, and how long it had taken me to tell the difference. I had spent 4 decades being someone's background. Not because I was forced to. I had chosen my life and I had loved parts of it genuinely. But I had also made myself small in ways I had not fully recognized until I sat in Sandra's office and heard David's numbers and understood that Gerald had been making himself larger at my expense for a very long time. And he had counted on the fact that I would never look closely enough to see it. That was the thing he got wrong. Not the legal strategy, not the footnotes, that. The assumption that I had not been paying attention, that I was just the woman who made the pot roast and found the charger. I am 68 years old. I have a garden that is doing beautifully. I have a daughter who calls me every Sunday, and a son who flew across the country to sit on my porch. I have Ruth, who has been my friend for 42 years and who, the week after the settlement was finalized, showed up at my door with a bottle of good wine and absolutely no intention of leaving before we had finished it. I have my dignity. I have my name. I have a house that is mine, completely and without dispute, and a pension that I earned across 31 years of standing in front of classrooms and caring about other people's children. And I have the knowledge that when it mattered, when everything I had built was at stake, I did not panic and I did not crumble. I paid attention. I planned. I waited. And I smiled when I signed the papers because I already knew how the story ended. If you are a woman listening to this who is somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story, please hear me. Find a lawyer who listens to you. Find a forensic accountant if your finances have ever been managed separately from yours. Do not let anyone, not your husband, not his attorney, not even your own fear, rush you into an agreement before you understand what you actually have. You have more than you think, almost certainly more than you have been told. And do not underestimate the value of knowing how to wait.